All right, I don't know what time it is on your clock, but I know what I'm getting ready for. It is time for the Professional CISO Podcast with David Malicoat.
Welcome, one and all, to the Professional CISO Show. I'm your host, David Malicoat. This show is an exploration of topics necessary to transform the role of the CISO into one of a professional. All right, gang, a little bit different today. This is a new trend that I'm going to start here. So we have a provocative conversation. So I say that, I want to give credit where credit is due. So recently, I heard this term from Walt Zerminski. He's the former CISO of Brown Brothers Harriman and State Street. And now he's a partner at Fortium. So I believe this term encapsulates the direction in which we should be striving, which is we have to put things out there and kind of necessarily stop agreeing on everything, right? I think there's this opportunity to be a little provocative and say, hey, let's push these boundaries a little bit. Let's get ourselves into a place where we drive to disagree. Just because we disagree doesn't mean that one person is bad or the other. In the end, what we want to be able to take the conversation further. So in that vein, today we're going to talk about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Is it time to break it apart? But before we begin, what I want to talk about today is we have the second annual North Texas ISA Golf Tournament coming up on November 4th. It is a noon shotgun start, and it'll be held at the Hackberry Country Club. And so just keep in mind, these folks are out there, they volunteer their time, board members, others as well. And this is the primary way that they do a lot of good, which is this is how they fund, one of the primary ways that they fund their scholarships for cybersecurity students in the region. So I want to make sure that we get the word out. So if you're a vendor, you might want to definitely consider sponsoring. I believe the packages are out now. Just contact your local board member or go through the website. And if you're a practitioner, especially CISO or senior level, participate, right? Get out there. Even if you don't golf, it can be fun. Promise. I did it last year. It was a great time. And then if you're anyone else, there's volunteer opportunities as well. So those are available. Check in and see how you can participate and help that thing go off without a hitch. And then finally, please like, follow, share. It's the best way to make sure that this great content keeps coming your way. And if you're on the Apple or Spotify, hit that follow button. Hit subscribe for YouTube. Follow us on LinkedIn. We put out a lot of good content, a lot of clips from the shows, a lot of hey, what's out and about, what's going on in the world, especially in cybersecurity. So and in the end, share us with a colleague. Let's see if we can get this thing growing even more than what it has so far and get the word out. But I appreciate it. All right, so now we're going to get into our main content. Is it time to break apart GRC? So I want to start out with a word for our listeners, right? So if you're sitting here going, hey, what's this guy talking about? I think he's a little crazy. We do it right, whatever. If you're doing it correctly, then I'm not talking to you, right? But in my travels and my travails and my interviews and talking with colleagues across the nation, there's challenges. And I think that we have an opportunity to kind of break the mold a little bit, but you never know. You could still learn and learn something by listening. So stick with us and see where the journey takes us. First off, here's what I want to do. I want to tell you a little short story, right? And the point of it is just to kind of illustrate maybe where we're at a little bit, because this is not unique. I think maybe that would be the other thing to illustrate. So it's 1942. And let's say you're the British commander in Singapore in the early stages of the Second World War, right? And so by way of your fortified military base, you're tasked with defending the island and its economic port and the surrounding Malay archipelago, right? So you just kind of picture this. You've got this kind of sprawled area, Singapore being kind of the center of the universe there. It's got this great amount of armament and defenses set up. So you have traditional air, land, and sea troops of the time, right? It's big fortifications. It's the ability to go and have these troops in a big garrison behind a big wall, right? But warfare is changing. And so you have this newfangled thing called radar at your disposal, and it's deployed throughout the region. So you have this ability to kind of see out, maybe even obviously much further than what you'd had been before. But interestingly enough, it doesn't quite fit into your traditional plans for battle. Maybe you just don't adopt it. You don't trust it yet, things like that. And so you're not necessarily embracing it fully. But the radar does work, right? Now, just because it works doesn't mean it's effective. I think we all can think about that in our own worlds in cybersecurity. But there's further complications, right? And which is the command and control around this radar is weak, right? And it's just very little maturity and not really effective. The information doesn't get where it needs to, which is the decision makers, in a timely manner. And if you ever studied anything about Pearl Harbor, that was one of the issues we had there, right? So it's a matter of, yes, they recognize things, but it's just not getting to the decision makers in time. And there were actual flights of Japanese attackers being recognized, right? But it was never exploited. And then finally, the overconfidence in the traditional way of defense, right? It's like, look, all those great new things are great, but you know what? We've got these walls, we've got all these troops, we've got these, anti-aircraft guns, we've got these this artillery. We're good. We're going to be fine. And so they had biased thinking, right? And another piece of this is that they thought the Japanese would only attack by sea. And how did it turn out? Well, the Japanese actually used all the above against the British, and they actually executed not only a seaborne attack, they also had an overland attack. In the end, it resulted in the largest surrender by the British Army in its history. All right, so we're going to put a pin in that for now. Think about that, kind of that arc as we go through the next few things. So as we move forward, I want to walk through GRC history a little bit, right? So maybe this is a walk down memory lane for some of you. You're like, oh yeah, I was there when that happened. Maybe the other side of it is, hey, man, this is the first time I've heard this. So maybe you're one of the younger CISOs or one of the younger practitioners out there, and this may be the first time hearing it. But in the end, we have the early days, right? So let's call it maybe the pre-2000s. And there's isolated silos in the business, especially around governance, risk, and compliance. But at that point, cybersecurity concerns were minimal, right? There just wasn't much in the way of these two things. I would say it was probably immature relative to the business itself, and maybe some strong, just like any business. Some were strong, some were weak. But in the end, not much way in the way of cyber for GRC. So moving along forward to the 2000s, right, where we kind of have the emergence of cybersecurity threats. You have the rise of the internet and the digital transformation, right? And there's a significant increase in compliance. So the outside folks, the people that don't sit in cybersecurity programs, they could see there is some sort of means by which they needed to put some action, some pressure into businesses to make sure that they're doing the right things with technology. But in the end, that's the compliance piece, right? But in the end, governance and risk really kind of lag. Again, when it's not necessarily as mature in the business, and maybe you have decent governance, but it doesn't extend into cybersecurity, or you maybe have a risk program, or you don't from the business side. But cybersecurity, at that point, we're a technical endeavor, right? So it seems to be that there's just it's just not developed yet. So let's get into the 2010s, right? We have the formalization of the GRC and cybersecurity. And this is where we start seeing a lot of those frameworks were created that explicitly included cybersecurity risk and controls. I would say the first things that come to mind there, ISO 27000, you have NIST with all their fun stuff that we see there, the risk management framework that came out. And so that's good, right? So we're starting to get some tools in place that we're able to kind of take advantage of to increase our maturity. Now we get to the 2020s. And I think the goal is there. I'm just of integrated GRC and cybersecurity. It's better than it ever has been, I will say that. We've had the rise of cloud computing, remote work, and evolving cyber threats like ransomware, right? And they have necessitated a more cohesive GRC framework. Do we get there? Well, I think the compliance pressures are there for sure, as we've seen so much with regulatory around finance, of course, healthcare with HIPAA. And so, yes, I think the compliance pressures are there. And cybersecurity is getting the attention of the board. Are we perfect? Are we there? Of course not. But in the end, I think we're better than we ever have been. But at the same time, is that what we should be accepting? Now, the velocity of technology is greater than ever, right? So we've got now AI. Obviously, cloud has already been, but it's continually. We have serverless and edge computing. So yeah, I mean, that velocity is only increasing. And so we have that gap between business use and stakeholder understanding of technology. It still remains wide, I think. The way I see it is and we talk about this on the show quite a bit, we have to be the experts. And so I think that is an area that this idea of GRC kind of being broken apart and really put into place in its requisite areas, I think that's where we have some opportunity. So let's move forward and let's talk about the present situation, right? And we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but so generally thinking of, and again, there's people out there doing it right, don't get me wrong, but in the end, it's relatively low maturity because what I see and when I talk to folks, it's a function that kind of sits over to the side, right? And there's a set of functions outside the program as well, depending on your company, but then you have that functions inside, and I kind of posit this idea that do we have that function just in response to some compliance, right? It's almost like the inception of compliance. You have GRC because people tell you have to have GRC. And so in a cyber program, it's grouped together, but it's really kind of in a separate subgroup. And they're not given necessarily the time and attention and maybe even dollars necessary for significant effectiveness. In the idea that we're talking about here, which is like breaking them out, going and putting them and just using them more as a superpower rather than having it something that you must do and have that GRC space. Why does it sit this way? Well, I think part of it could be our history, right? Where it seems to stem from this technical focus of cybersecurity programs of the past. And I think we're all pretty well in the idea that, right, we're risk managers now. We are kind of, yes, technology, or there's a technical piece to what we do, but in the end, CISOs specifically are risk managers on the executive team specific to technology. And so I think another piece of this is, since the prevalence of cyber leaders, they're out there and again, grew up technical, and then you kind of enter this mix of unfamiliar skill sets, right? So, because we know GRC, it's a different skill set. And so to have this ability to say, man, I've led these technical folks. I've been a technical person my entire career. I know how these folks think. Now I have to go. It'd be like going and saying, okay, hey, CISO, you're going to go lead marketing for a while, right? It's a different set of the way people operate and the way their brains kind of operate. So I think there's a little bit of a challenge there, so which tends to, as a human being, we kind of say, I'm going to go with what I know, but at the same time, over here, I'm going to kind of work with them, but being that I'm not confident in what I'm doing, I may not be able to help them grow in maturity to that level. And then I think the kind of another piece too is there's a lot of businesses where these functions don't exist in the business itself, or they don't exist in a way that is recognizable. And so what does that challenge of standing up a general business function inside a largely technical program look like, right? So you have, hey, and I can say I've done this myself. Hey, company, you don't have a risk program at all, but I'm going to start one, and I'm going to start it basically in cyber. It's not easy. It's not easy to get everybody on board. It's not easy to get everybody involved and really believing in what you're doing, back to, previous episodes with stakeholder management, things like that. And so there's that challenge, right? Because now you're kind of a trailblazer, and you're almost dictating to the business what they should be doing. And that's not typically how we have done business in the past. And so, there can be those questions like, hey, Dave, is that really what you're spending your time and resources on? Right? Should you be doing that, or should you just be going and taking care of all those technical controls to make sure that we're safe? Right? Again, not advocating for that. I'm saying that could be some of the questions that you'd get if you decide to branch out and do that. And that's where I go, honestly, into the, back in those days of, and I've heard this from multiple interviews as well. Hey, we're okay, and just, we got this taken care of, right? Just tell me that we're safe. We're good with cyber. And obviously that doesn't work anymore. It never really did in the beginning, but and especially now with the rapid pace of innovation and change that's going on in technology. And so when we talk about outcome, right, I think what from those things that we just talked about. So what happened? I think they needed a bucket to kind of put everything in, and and think of it in kind of a tech non-tech idea. And so I have all the technical things over here, which is my SOC and my my threat intelligence and those other things. And then you turn around and say, well, I have all this non-technical stuff. Well, let's group that together over here and put the like people in there. It kind of seems like they needed a place to put kind of all these non-tech functions, right? So we have technical over here. It's my SOC, my cyber threat intelligence. We have the threat hunting. And then over here, we have kind of these other things that are relatively non-technical. And so we kind of have these two groupings of things. And I think that's really kind of where that came from, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so the other piece is there could be drivers as well, which is just by the nature of GRC requirements or compliance requirements from some of these frameworks or some of these external third parties. Well, maybe, just maybe, that's where we said, hey, we've all done it. You've had the checklist compliance look, right? And maybe we said, you know what? You need to have a governance risk compliance function. Great, I've got one. There it is. It's in this nice little bucket, and it's easy to tend to. And by look over there, I have GRC. And so you had to do it, right? Even if you really didn't do them well. And I think there's room to grow for everybody in this. So maybe there's reason, right? And we can kind of think about why. Why did we dump them together, right? So 3 distinctly different functions. I think the way it looks to me, which is I found interesting in just kind of thinking through this problem space of this idea that, governance is one thing, right? Risk, obviously, totally different functionality, and obviously they interplay with one another, and then obviously compliance is kind of this thing out here, which is the must-dos, which we'll get into in a second. But so yeah, they're related, but so is SecOps and threat intelligence, right? Those are kind of grouped together. In the end, anyone can make the argument for they're all related. Everything's related in some form or fashion, right? So let's look at the triple stack, right? You got governance, which is the overarching framework of checks and balances in your program. It drives your policies, processes, and procedures. And of course, it defines how you implement and execute on security throughout your organization and how you manage it on the day-to-day. Just like you would a business, right? Same idea. It's like, you can also think of the cybersecurity program as a mini business inside the business. Not a bad way to think about it. Next is risk. Risk is a lens by which all programs need to drive decision-making. Hopefully it's not too controversial, about the why, right? But in the end, this is how your business makes decisions, whether there's a formal program involved or not. So you need to adopt that look, right, or that process, and then because in the end you're either aligned or you're not aligned, and if you're misaligned, then you're not driving the appropriate business risk decisions into your cybersecurity program. So I think the risk opportunity there is to be able to say, hey, I understand my business risk, and I can tie virtually every single one of those things into the components of my cybersecurity program. And then finally, let's talk about compliance. These are the have-to-dos, right? Everybody, I'm probably sure, sitting there maybe shuddering a little bit or rolling their eyes, which is, you have to do these things. Good thing about compliance is it tends to get you some budget, right? So I think there's positives there, but also keep in mind that these are the compliance things can drive risk, right? You can have a compliance risk, or it can drive the way you govern. Right? So you may be trying to do a pure risk-based decision-making on what your controls look like, but in the end, and that's how you govern your cybersecurity program. But now all of a sudden you have this new compliance thing that comes up, and it's changing the way you govern because now you're having to take and look at the compliance pieces of what's going on, and you govern differently. So something to think about there as well. So one of the things I want to talk about real quick is a special note around governance. And I think there's a special place for it, which is, I think everybody does it. It's similar to kind of the business, but I think there's opportunity there to increase the maturity. And I think if there's any one area that we're talking about in a cybersecurity program, the governance, it requires the leadership and attention of the CISO, I would say daily, if not more, right? You setting the strategic direction of your program, you tying into the business. This is what you're there for. And again, I'm sure there's people going to be like, well, duh, Dave. But honestly, there's some folks, many folks could be out there saying, hey, yeah, okay, now I get it. I'm making that. So can we pull that G out of GRC, and with our underlings or with our people that report to us, and really bring it in home into our way of thinking, our strategy, our be active in how you govern your program on the day-to-day. And so you can go out there and have someone else run risk, right? You can have say, hey, go, manage the process of getting risks and identifying them and finding out how to measure them and mitigate them. Somebody else can do that. I'm not saying you have to do that. Obviously, you need to weigh in, of course, from a strategic direction. But in the end, you can also do it with compliance. You can say, hey, go look at that framework. Go look at that compliance framework and make sure that we're where we need to be. That's something you can delegate as well. But I think from a governance perspective, you have to have the speed and effectiveness of this decision making. And you have to be personally involved as a CISO or as the senior leader in cybersecurity. You can delegate the gears, but you can't offload the direct hand for effectiveness. And just by the nature of saying this, right, this negates the idea of pushing this into a function named GRC. And so I would encourage people to say, look, if I have a GRC function, well, yes, we do those things, but we don't necessarily have a GRC function, right? I do governance. Here's how I do it. I am the leader of governance as the CISO. Risk. I have my risk leader. They are the person. They are. Let's look at the RACI model, right? They're there as the person that manages the risk on the day-to-day. And then compliance, right? Could be the same person, could be other people. Again, you're always going to have input into this, but in the end, it's something that from the governance perspective, it rests squarely on your shoulders, and you don't have that ability to delegate. So I think I hit that one pretty hard. So let's move forward a little bit. So let's talk about the future, right? And I think just like anything else, the whole reason for the show, I think the whole reason for why I get on and do this on a weekly basis is that we're making strides, and I think we have opportunity, right, to continually improve, have that continuous improvement, have that continual increase, even how small in cybersecurity maturity. And I think it sits with these provocative conversations, as Walt had said to me yesterday, which is we're making strides, but I still think we have a disconnection from the board generally. Of course, everything I say is kind of generally. There's people that have direct access to the board and they're in front of them all the time, and that's great. I think it's on you, if you are one of those people, to make yourself heard on how that works and how it, hey, open invitation. If you have a direct line into your board, particularly at a public company, you have a standing invitation to come on the Professional CISO Show as a guest and talk us through how you do that, right? Because I think on the whole, whether it be board or executive suite or anything, on the majority of us are in a place where we're disconnected. And I think we should be able to increase our internal program maturity when it comes to these things. I think it's almost a case of becoming undeniable, right? Why not be the beacon that your business goes to and says, man, they're over there doing governance really well. Maybe we can take a page out of their book. Our goal should be to increase that internal maturity, right? That programmatic maturity around governance, again, not in the bucket, but out as a CISO, leading in governance, be the example. Risk, the same way. Establish that risk program. Make it where everybody can see it, right? Be the example. Same thing with compliance. Everybody has compliance across the business. Maybe you can put it together in a way that you're so reactive and you're so watertight when it comes to how you do your compliance that your business would take and use some of those processes and some of those approaches that you had put into place. And so in the end, you do that, and the idea would be that then we're ready. So when our stakeholders, realize that, or they get to the point where they say, "Holy smokes, these guys are really doing it right," man, they're ready to make the bridge is already built, halfway built, if not more, right? So we have that opportunity. And then they start connecting the dots. And next thing you know, now all of a sudden you're inside and you're operating and you have a lot of what we call influence. You have a lot of influence on how things are moving forward. So unlike now where a lot of us are on the outside looking in. All right, so you can't forgo cyber risk, right? Even if your company doesn't have a formal program. I think I kind of mentioned this earlier. This is an example I provide all the time. Just do it, right? I mean, in the words of Nike, just do it. You have to be able to say, can I recognize that? Set up that formal program, get at least you be the executive sponsor and push it down to your people, have them participate, right? Again, once you get those reps in and once you start getting that maturity up, it will be recognized and people will gravitate toward it and, be the change you want to see in the world, right? Have that idea where you're saying, hey, I'm going to establish it. We have to evaluate risk. And then that gives you a basis by which you can leverage and go and say, hey, I'm considering this risk when it comes to technology. Can you provide me some of the business background on the risk that I'm seeing from a technological perspective? Holy smokes. What way to build that bridge and be able to dive into the business and be able to say, now you're not just asking them questions, but you're communicating your maturity by the questions that you're asking. Here's one that I've had some conversations with, and I'm not saying this in a way. Have you ever had a goal, right, where you say, hey, I know I'm never going to be perfect, right? I'm never necessarily going to get there, but that shouldn't stop me from trying, right? And I think this falls under that category where we say every single control deployed into your enterprise, cybersecurity controls, should tie back to a risk, right? Think about that for a second, right? I think it's a long-term goal you can have. Are we ever going to get there? Maybe not. But I think being able to say, I look at things through that risk lens and I can now go and say, why am I doing this, right? Why am I implementing this control? Is it because it's on a framework? So does that mean it's compliance and it's a framework risk? And so now I have a compliance risk. You see what I'm saying? You can always tie this back. And this also goes back to plucking that risk out of that GRC bucket and saying, hey, let's put this out and let's spread it across our entire organization. So everybody, you're training your people to be risk managers. Why? Because guess what? Where we're at today, in the CISO world and how we're becoming risk managers, when they get to our level, it's already going to be expected of them. So you had better train them that way. So to be able to say, look, train them how to connect the dots when it comes to business risk, to technological risk, to cyber risk, to what are you deploying in your enterprise to be able to mitigate or take care of that risk. All right. And let's talk about compliance for a second, right? As we all know, these are the must-dos, right? Now, something to be said, and it's the old cliche, which is we all know the compliance doesn't equal security. But it's just one piece of the overall cybersecurity program puzzle, right? Now, what if we had this opportunity to say, if I could map these compliance requirements to risk-driven cybersecurity controls, right? So maybe I could create this matrix and I could speak to a place where I could say, here's this control I have implemented. Yes, over here, it is driven by compliance, right? I know that because there it is. There's that framework that we're referencing it to. But oh, by the way, over here on my risk register, it's also there. So this is a dual purpose control. This is something that we're bringing together to say, yes, it gets us compliant, but also it gives us a reduction in a risk in some way or a mitigation. And so then when you do that, what do you have? Well, you have this cross-reference, and you can say, well, am I addressing all my risks by what I'm doing for compliance, or vice versa? Am I addressing all my risks by what I'm doing for compliance? I would hope so, but I bet not, right? So in the end, you're going to have a gap maybe either way. Are there ways that you can look for overlap, right? Where you're putting those two things together and saying, I'm double paying for this, or I'm doing double work on this. Or you may have some gaps and say, look, I have an opportunity here to take out 4 or 5 of these things at the same time, right? So to say, well, maybe I have this opportunity to find a way on the compliance side, let's say budget, right? Budget can be driven pretty well by compliance, and say, oh, I'll be able to take care of these other things as well. Gives you a great way to look at your cybersecurity program. But again, if GRC is sitting over here in a bucket, you're not doing it that way. All right. So as we wrap up, one, you don't want to be the British commander of the troops in Singapore during the early stages of the Second World War, right? Use all these tools available to you, right? GRC, as it sits today, is the radar in Singapore for the British, right? It's there, right? And it kind of works, right? Are you doing it because you have to? Or are you doing it because your top level general or the minister of defense told you that you had to have this radar? Well, if you're using GRC that way, that's what it looks like. But what if you actually harnessed and made sure that the information from the radar went directly to the intelligence center, to the operations center, to where you were say, hey, oh my gosh, looky there, we've got Japanese coming in, and you can thwart those attacks, right? Very similar in nature. How can we take this piece and say, look, I'm going to go and use it to its fullest extent? And maybe, just maybe, it'll give me superpowers. Is this a place I can look to invest and really capture what's going on? And in the case of cybersecurity, right, as we're talking here, it's kind of the opposite, right? GRC is not a technical tool. We're all technical people. Radar is technical compared to those things to the British. So it's kind of the opposite, but very similar. What we're saying here is, hey, it's available. It's there, right? You have to make it a priority, and you have to say, hey, can I break this thing apart? Can I adopt governance as my mantle, as my big thing as a CISO or as the leader of this cybersecurity organization? And then can I go and give risk its proper place and appropriateness, right? Build that program, build those bridges inside the company. And then can I take compliance? Can I use it as a tool to go grab that budget? Can I use it as a tool to help make sure that I'm matrixing in this idea of risk and compliance together, so I can have a full built program and look at that program and be able to say, hey, I have opportunities here to either drive more, or I have redundancies. Maybe I can save some money somewhere. In the end, I think there's an opportunity here, right? Some people are doing it right. I've talked to those folks as well, right? But in the end, if you look at it and say, look, if I've got GRC sitting over here in this little bucket, can I break it out? Can I make it into what it can be? Can I make it into a superpower for my cybersecurity program and for the business that I support? I gotta say, that was it was an educational. I will go there first. And second, I will say I appreciate your license to give me to be able to have these kind of conversations, because in the end, it is those provocative conversations that are going to get us where we need to be. So, colleagues and friends, I renew the call. It's time to professionalize the role of the CISO. In the meantime, I wish you health, happiness, and success on your journey in becoming the professional CISO. Let's do this.
We're professionalizing the CISO role, so please subscribe to the Professional CISO podcast.